Well, it sounds like it has been a great conference. I am very excited to be with you to cap this off. Can you hear me okay? Bad echo? Getting a wave. Good, good. All right. So I don't know if you've been getting these yet, but just like Christmas cards, the 2020 prediction cyber threat email has been hitting my inbox left and right. Bonus points. Has anyone been asked to write a cybersecurity prediction for 2020? A couple. Okay, good. So here's what this, in my mind, dreaded December tradition is in our industry. Someone, and I'll throw marketing under the bus for a second, comes up with the bright idea that a December blog or article or something or other about what's coming next would be a great thing for your CEO or your cybersecurity team to write, and out it comes, the newest, most dreamed up scenario that's a tweak on what's happened in the past, but all that scarier or apocalyptic, and it comes out in this prediction blog, right? And the analyst who had to write it hurt their heart just a little bit, thinking about if they had to deal with that threat next time, right? Well, here's what I want to do today. As an antidote to those prediction articles you're going to be seeing, I want us here on the cusp of the next decade, of the 20s, as wild as that is to start thinking about, I want us to start thinking about what the last decade taught us in this space. As security professionals, as people who care deeply about the people and assets that we're trying to protect, as people who are looking at the multitude of different threats and thinking, how do I stand up to the face of this for my company or for my family, for myself, for my country? How do I start to take on this complexity personally? Let's look back for a few minutes today about what the last 10 years have showed us and how we might use those lessons as guide points for ourselves as we start taking on the next dimension of the threat in the 20s. I want to play with a little model that I've been throwing around here with you all today. And what I'm positing is that the way to think about the last decade, starting in 2010, with how the Chinese government and military was stealing wholesale intellectual property theft from corporate networks, to our ending days in here in 2019, where the threat of the Russian government and military in the next election is looming in everyone's minds, and take those two bookends and look at those problems by dissecting it on three different levels. The first is about admitting there's a problem. The second is admiring that problem. And then the third part of this model is starting to solve for the problem. So admit there's a problem, admire it, and then start solving it. And I think that's the lens, the sort of three-part lens, that has shown us what we can start learning from the threats that we've been up against for this last decade. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start at China. Back in 2010, I think we had a quintessential Washington secret, something that a lot of people knew, and it was way too interesting to stay a secret. And it was this. It was that the Chinese military was stealing defense industrial base military secrets. There were uncanny pictures of F-35 fighter jets showing up in Chinese military parades that looked way too close to the actual F-35. There were traces of engineering plants that were out in the Midwest that were getting built, and they looked identical to what was getting built in China. There were these eerie signals that something was going on with the Chinese military, intellectual property theft, and no one quite had put the pieces together. And then on the other side, there were these IT departments that were looking at these remote access Trojans. Something called Shady Rat would come out. A paper would come out from a security company, and it dissected all the code in these different types of malware that were starting to hit corporate networks. And it looked complex, and it looked interesting, and data was going out the door, was getting exfiltrated. But no one had quite put this all together yet. And because of that, we couldn't quite figure out with this problem that Boeing was getting pulled into special meetings about, and Congress was curious about, and tons of people across the intelligence and security community were scratching their heads. Then we get to 2013. And the New York Times runs a piece about itself, about the New York Times. And in that January expose, the New York Times says the Chinese government has been hacking the New York Times reporters in China and getting information about their contacts and sources on the ground in China. Address books, calendars, emails. Now, the New York Times, as a paper, wants to put this out and doesn't feel too threatened in a way to tell their own news because, hey, they're a newspaper and they're trying to explain this, fine. That is the first time that we see this Chinese data theft in cyberspace combination starting to come out widely in public. Well, then a month later, and I was fortunate enough to be on the team that was part of this effort, a month later, in 2013, a report that detailed out how the Chinese military, a group called the PLA's Unit 61398, had been taking everything from steel alloy information to the blueprints of pharmaceuticals to green energy, IP, and R&D that had taken 15, 20, 25 years in many cases from the target. And that had been stolen with a set of internet infrastructure behind it that was laid out in excruciating detail in a report called APT1, or Advanced Persistent Threat 1. And what that report did is it exposed these mechanics of how a cyber threat campaign worked. And it drew the line from these forensic data points all the way up to nation-state intent, the 5-year plan that the Chinese government had put out that aligned the areas of innovation and intellectual property that it needed in order to advance further. And it was that combination of understanding the geopolitical and economic needs of a country and lining up the forensics behind it that started to move us from admitting there was a problem and admiring it to being able to solve 4 pieces of it. And when we decided to release that report, we knew we needed to do that because we were in a position where we had 140 different companies who had been hacked. And at the time, the company was called Mandiant, it's now FireEye, but Mandiant had been doing these firefights, these incident response work at Fortune 500s, and was in a place where we could characterize the sources, the types of companies that were getting hit, but not go and expose the actual company. And no company in 2013, and no company likes doing it today, no company in 2013 wanted to come forward and explain, here's what's happened on my network, it's an existential threat, and all my IP just went out the door. Imagine what it would do to your stock price and your PR team's heart, right? So needless to say, this was a task that needed to happen, and we felt there was a duty to figure out how to expose what was a nation-state threat against corporations. And that report and the pursuing information that came out afterwards really started giving people the ability, just a second, really started giving people the ability to pick this big, thorny problem apart. And what happened next? Now, this is a similarity I think you're going to see as we go through these different nation-state adversaries of the last 10 years. Picking apart this problem and starting to solve for it wasn't something where you found a huge wholesale global solution the next week. It felt a lot more like WhackAMole. If you remember the game, right? The mole comes up and you hit it down. So here's what I mean. After this Mandiant report really pulled together that the Chinese military was out taking intellectual property from all of these corporations, the next thing that happened was in 2014, the Department of Justice indicted 5 PLA, Chinese military officers, on the charges of stealing intellectual property theft from these companies. And they laid out in excruciating detail all of the specific charges around stealing intellectual property. And at the time, the chattering class all said, oh, come on, this is just a show trial. The Chinese aren't going to extradite these military officers. What could this do in the face of intellectual property theft costing the country billions of dollars, happening left and right multiple times a day at multiple enterprises across the country? Well, then 2015 comes around, and then President Obama signs an agreement with President Xi, agreeing to halt the property theft, intellectual property theft, taken through computer networks. And again, at the time, everyone said, come on, an international agreement, a handshake like this will do nothing in the face of this widespread threat. Well, what did we see behind the scenes? My teams, we've been tracking how those different Chinese APT groups, including the Chinese military, had been working through that time. And what we saw was a dip in the number of compromises right after that 2014 Department of Justice indictment. And then from 2015 on, after that agreement, we didn't see incidents of compromise by these Chinese government groups. Was this real? Had we really deterred this threat in such a way that this sort of whack-a-mole approach had kept all the moles down on the table, right? Had this worked? And what we saw was a story that was representative of, I think, what would come and what's going to come. We had solved, or we had at least started collectively, in the private side and the public side, to say that there is a norm. There's a state-recognized type of behavior that's not allowed here. Stealing intellectual property, not good. This should not happen. And we were able to communicate that through the step-by-step solve of this huge problem. But then here's the other side. Since 2015, since this agreement and the years that have come, the Chinese government and state-owned enterprises have gotten far more aggressive about partnerships with US tech companies, partnerships and acquisitions of robotics company in Germany, and other legitimate ways to go and buy intellectual property theft. But the other side of that, too, is we have to understand that that threat has morphed, more moles are coming up, and the way that you think about what the risk is around a corporate agreement or an MOU with another company from a country and a military that has previously stolen that data takes that mindset. It requires that next question of what will that information be used for. So this threat morphs. Our ability to approach it and start knocking pieces of it down requires thinking through the problem. In this case, it was exposing it. The next piece is figuring out who acts and how. And then I think the most important piece and lesson that we have here is to make sure your eyes are open to what just happened from a security standpoint as you go into the next relationships with your business, with your IT department, in your company. That's what China started to teach us. You could start to take on these really complex threats and set some norms of behavior around it. But how about North Korea? Who remembers the Sony breach in 2014? No one? A few. Well, there was an awful movie that I hope you did not have to sit through, but the movie that Sony was going to put out is the epitome of how we started changing our thinking about how threats to one country looked very different to people in another. So back in 2014, as everyone's getting ready for Christmas, a movie called The Interview, which was a satire but included the assassination of Kim Jong-un, was about to get released. And for months, Sony had been warned and had heard from this group calling themselves the Guardians of Peace that they shouldn't release this movie or the stakes are going to be very high. Very threatening notes coming out. Easy to dismiss. But there in 2014 starts leaking the emails of Sony's executives, and then within days, Sony is taken not just to its knees, but completely offline by destructive malware, to the point that in the cafeteria, you couldn't just use your credit card or walk in. Lights were on, but they had to go pull out the credit card machines from the basement with the old and start tracing your credit card again to even get transactions going. That's how much Sony was taken down. Not only were movies and staff not working, but this was a wholesale cyber attack in a kinetic sense, in a physical sense, that had happened. And by January, the government says we've got to figure out how to start solving this, right? We have this problem. We didn't quite realize that a state like North Korea, a rogue state, a state that was not seen as a high-level power on typical economic or political or military means, a state like North Korea was now able to have a massive effect, in this case, on a US corporation. Oh, or in this case, Japanese corporation. And it was that question that was now starting to get answered. Yes, this type of state has the power to do that, but how do we start to impose costs on a state like that? How do you respond was really the question. And for the very first time, a government, in this case the US government, came out and said this was the work of North Korean hackers, state-sponsored North Korean hackers. And that was the first public attribution by a government to cyber attack in the US. And what precedent that laid was that you now could start unwrapping this problem by explaining who was behind it, just like we had seen with the Chinese. Attribution and understanding who was behind it was important. But figuring out how a government could respond to this and do it quickly was now on the table. And what we really wanted to look at, after all of these different types of responses, by the mid-teens, so 2013 on, was understanding how do you respond in a way that is not going to escalate? How do you respond in a way that's proportional? These questions of international law start getting applied to this space that just a few years before was still the purview of a couple IT guys and a question of how do we make sure that our passwords are safe, right? So we went from having to deal with what felt like a niche industry issue to one that was existential, board level, policymaker, top of government. But then we really threw a bear into the whole question. And that is, how do you deal with what the Russian government has been doing? And if there's any threat actor that has been the gift that keeps giving in terms of threat types, I would put Russia up for that category. So beginning of the 2010s, what we see is the Russian government, and the Russian military in particular, coming out with a doctrine that lays out that they're going to use this domain that they're referring to as the information space, while the US is calling it cyberspace, this information space domain as a way to conduct warfare. And they're going to do it to favorably predispose world opinion to the Russian use of force. Well, to the world of Russian nerds, that said, hey, we're going to look at, if we're the Russian government, we're going to be looking at how we modify our warfare capabilities to deal in this evolving space that the internet is only part of. And behind that was an understanding that this new domain, where the Russian military would be playing, included the thoughts and content and perceptions, not just the ones and zeros and the technical hardware of the internet, but the actual types of sentiment that people were understanding as the impression of the country and how the country was acting outside. And it was that more psychological definition that Russia was laying the fingerprints for in its military doctrine openly for years as it thought through how will warfare, how will politics be evolving. And that's just 2010. What we saw next was what I kind of think of as the boogeyman question. Russia's saying there's intent. They're interested in doing these military actions in cyberspace. We can see all this criminal activity that's coming out of Russia, but doesn't look like the Russian government. There's some pretty good, criminal and credit card hacks going on. Fine. So there's capability, there's intent from this doctrine, but we can't quite figure out what the Russian government's doing. Maybe they're too good and we can't even see this. Maybe they're so good we haven't caught them. So this theory's kind of played with. Everyone's out looking on the private side and on the government side. How are we going to understand what the Russian proof points are, to understand what the Russian military is doing? Well, then 2014 comes around, and a couple things happen. The first is this. In Ukraine, the country's been invaded by the Russian military, and the elections after the coup that had just put the old president out of business and over in Russia, Yanukovych, he's out, and they've got a new question of who's going to be the next president. This election starts in 2014. Election results are coming back in from the rest of Ukraine, and then the Central Election Commission's website goes down. Get it back up. They just think it's a regular old DDoS, too much traffic coming into the website. Well, it comes back up, and this little tiny opposition, very fringe party candidate for president in Ukraine comes up as the winner. Well, someone catches this before it goes on and says, the site's getting messed with. We eventually find out this is also probably the same Russian government-sponsored group of hackers that was changing what the scorecard was for this election in 2014. The world doesn't make much about it because, hey, it's 2014. A lot else is going on and has been going on in Ukraine after the Russian invasion. But this is really the canary in the coal mine for understanding the types of trials that the Russian government's going to start using over the next few years. The other piece was this. In 2014, we started to get some proof points of what Russia's demonstrated government and military capability was in cyberspace. The boogeyman was out, and here's what it looked like. By mid-2014, a bunch of reports start coming out, and one including APT28, Advanced Persistent Threat 28, which I was part of writing, and these reports detail out that a group that looks like the Russian military or Russian government is taking the emails of military defense attachés, the emails out of Chechen journalists. They're going after the ministries of defense in countries in the former satellite states, Soviet Union, and they're going after military and defense shows. So the targets appear to be clearly aligned with Russia's military interests. And oh, by the way, the malware that they're using, the timestamps on it, line up for 7 years to be within 90% of the time, 93% of the time, within the working hours in Moscow. And oh, by the way, the language setting is in Russian, and the details start to accumulate to align to a judgment that the Russian military is likely the sponsor of this activity. So 2014 opens up this broader understanding in the larger security community that the Russian government's up to something, but it feels pretty regional. There's this Ukraine hack, there's this APT28, or some people call it Fancy Bear activity going on, but it looks like it aligns with what any military intelligence group worth their salt should be doing. Regular old espionage to some degree, right? But what came next started to really change the way we thought about the threat. 2015 and 2016, the two first widely attributed power grid attacks happen, and they're in Ukraine. And it's by a group called Sandworm, which is also probably out of the same Russian military intelligence unit, the GRU. And in 2015 and 2016, just before Christmas in Ukraine, in 2015, it's first a distribution plant, and by 2016, it's now a transmission plant, moving up the arteries of the power plants. And what happens is the power plants have the circuits turned off remotely. Well, in Ukraine, everybody still knows how to go and back up their power plant, and out the technicians go and turn on the power back, and they're back on the grid. But what happened in the meantime were a combination of factors. In some cases, call centers were inundated with calls where no one would pick up the line just as the power was going out. In other cases, the malware wasn't even directly on the system. The system had been copied, and there was remote access to the circuits from another computer elsewhere. This was the work of someone or a group that had really planned out, how do you send a signal? How do you take a kinetic step, something where literally the lights are going off, and the lights aren't just going off in the power station and on the power grid, they were going off in the control room that had a backup generator. They were thinking through how you send a signal to show what the stakes are. And it was those, they're called black energy incidents, it was those black energy attacks in 2015 and 2016 that woke up, in many cases, the critical infrastructure community to a new heightened level of how you start to deal with this problem. We had been admiring it. We had been admitting that power grids weren't safe. We had had those discussions for years, for 5, 6, 7 years at least. But now you could start solving for the problem because you were starting to see how this could work. And then just this last year, the Department of Homeland Security came out and said that there have been traces of black energy found at utilities in the US. So here's Russia presenting us with a couple different threats by 2016. They've now presented this military espionage and intelligence threat with APT28. They've presented this interest in elections, but sort of minor when it came to the actual threat, taking down a website, changing a website, fine. And then this power grid attack. So we're getting these different threat types. And then 2017 comes. And what is the most expensive cyber attack and damaging cyber attack of all time, which I think has been highly underreported, happens? Not Petya, 2017. In this case, it's just about to be Ukrainian Constitution Day, which is a state holiday in Ukraine. And a piece of accounting software, sort of the TurboTax of Ukraine, it's called MEDoc, that many multinationals working in Ukraine were using to file their taxes. An exploit on MEDoc allows destructive malware to take down multiple multinationals in June and July 2017, and it's Maersk, a shipping company, and a lot of this has been widely reported, and a variety of other companies, including Mondelez, a chocolate company, Merck Pharmaceutical, and others, are taken down. Their operations are taken down. Their networks are destroyed via this NotPetya malware. Now, what happened in the real world? Maersk has 16 of its 76 ports down. That's Rotterdam to Mumbai. The cranes are frozen, and the actual screen that a barge captain's looking at doesn't have the instructions of how to unload or where he should be coming into the port to unload his cargo. The only backup that Maersk can find is one domain controller, which luckily had gone off in Ghana because they had had a power outage the night before, and that one domain controller hadn't been online and infected with NotPetya, and they're able to get Maersk, this huge shipping conglomerate, online another 10 days later. All this to say, here was the cyber 9/11, if you want to put it that way. Here was the actual cyber attack that should have woken up so many people, and did wake up the insurance industry in a lot of ways, but really woke up the world and should have woken up the world to see how deep this threat is, how existential this threat is, and how this problem needs to be solved on all of these different pieces. So I think we're still in the admiring phase of really understanding what a piece of malware as destructive as NotPetya did to companies that were in Ukraine, what Russia considers an adversary and what you could consider a war zone today. But I've left out one example when it comes to Russia, and that's 2016 in the US. And I've done that purposely because I think we are still in the admiring the problem category. And that's what I'm really worried about. So in 2016, there's been such a haze around this, so while we all lived through this, I'm going to go back for just a second so we can remember what the different pieces of this were and really take apart the problem as we think about how to solve it. The Democratic National Committee's networks are hacked, emails are taken. The group behind it is APT28, the same group that we knew from 2014, along with another Russian government group as well. Emails are taken, emails are put online. These stolen emails are put online, and the stories that come out, the media stories pursuant to this hack, are about the content of the emails. The DNC doesn't like Bernie Sanders. That's the story, not the Russian military has just stolen documents from the Democratic National Committee and isn't trying to put their thumb on the scales in an election, right? So the whole summer, they're talking about the content of these emails, not that the Russian government's involved. Then, and this one always gets forgotten in 2016, the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, just a few days after the Russian athletes are banned from the Olympics in Rio in 2016, is hacked, and the files from US and other athletes are put online. Same infrastructure, the same group, APT28, Russian military, does the same thing. And those the athletes' files are put online as an attempt to show, look, they're taking drugs too. In this case, it was prescription medicine for gymnasts, but looking for a way to change the conversation in the same way that they had conducted this hack and leak effort in the DNC. So we're seeing APT28 do this combination of hacking and then leaking the information. In parallel, we're also seeing the amplification of different hashtags to promote those leaks. We're seeing on Twitter, we're seeing on Facebook, and this came out later, but we're seeing on Facebook and we're seeing on Twitter an amplification of stories that are divisive in categories from Black Lives Matter to Texas secession to immigrants in Idaho, all over the map. If you could find a divisive issue, it was getting promoted by this troll farm known as the Internet Research Agency. So we have these parallel efforts happening in 2016. And if you remember what had happened in 2010, that initial layout of the Russian government thinking and the Russian military thinking that this domain wasn't just technical, but it was psychological. And warfare needed to happen in both a psychological and a technical way, and it would happen that way. Then you started to understand what was happening in 2016. It was that combination of the actual technical effect and the psychological effect occurring against targets as big as an American election in the minds that would help decide it. Since then, more and more has come out about these tactics, and I can't tell you how many disinformation conferences I personally have been to, but we've been admiring this problem, questioning what it looks like, and really trying to understand what to do about it. But here's the hard part, and here's what I think we have to start solving for. As enormous as this question of disinformation is, we have to start looking at how we, in our roles as security professionals, as executives, as people in an industry that's now grappling with a completely new set of environmental factors, starts to deal. So what does that mean? It means thinking about how the attention economy and social media's drive for incenting the most incendiary content is changing the way we consume information. It's changing the way your company's incident might get promoted faster than your PR team could ever imagine. It's thinking about how we change the incentive structure around that attention economy. It's starting to question what are the right ways to deal with a security threat that isn't just something that you can hand off to a CISO or a CSO, but one that's going to need to be taken on at both a legal level, at maybe a partnering with a government level, at thinking through what the existential stakes are around your company or you getting targeted. What will that mean for your disclosures? What will that mean for your insurance profile? We have to think about this space as far more than just the ones and zeros and an actual technical breach happening, but one where the psychological piece is now at play. And that brings me to how we go into 2020. Well, Russia has laid out this map of different threats in these different ways that they're interested in targeting, not for an ideological purpose, but to have the greatest effect. Well, we look at how China went from a wholesale intellectual property theft actor to a more nuanced approach to getting the R&D it needs, while we look at states that don't have the typical profile of a world power, but are figuring out how to play like one with North Korea. When we look at these threats in the last 10 years that we've had with them, I think the lessons we draw are these three things. The first is security decisions and security questions have now moved far from a technical fix, and they're now in the question of ethics and morals and thinking through what the right thing to do is. These are not simple questions. This isn't just about getting a lock on your door. It's figuring out what your company and what you stand for and how to respond that way. That's true to your principles. The second piece is this. We're not playing in a domain. We're not playing in a space that is just a technical one anymore. We're not playing with just a breach that can go in an SEC filing and explain a quantifiable amount of property that left your company or a risk inherent in your business model. We are dealing in a domain where we need people who can think widely and broadly about how best to protect their information assets, not just their physical assets. And finally, I'll leave you with a bit of a story. It's one of my favorites that came out of the Soviet Union. And to me, it illustrates the difference in approach when you have people taking individual responsibility and when people are empowered, or when you're looking for fixes from a government or something far outside of the system. And here's the story. Back towards the end of the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union's opening up, a delegation comes over from some of the high levels of the government, and they go over to London. And they're visiting the parliament, and they're visiting different parts of the city, and they're making sort of the rounds to understand and hear more about how the British government works. Then a day in, top guy on the Soviet side says, "Just stop," to the mayor of London. "Stop. I have a question. I can't go further with this tour anymore before I get it figured out. Take me to the central baker of London." And the British are puzzled. They say, "The baker? The central baker?" He said, "Who's controlling how many loaves are getting baked every day? I drive around this city, and there are no lines at the bakeries, and people are just getting bread. I need to understand where your central baker is. I want to talk to him." Well, of course, we all know there was no central baker. This was about individual bakeries and bakers figuring out how much bread they would sell that day and what their customers would buy. This was a diffused model. This was where the power to make a basic market decision, but to make a basic decision, was down at the edge of society. A bakery couldn't be a more obvious example. And it is that decentralized edge model that empowered people to figure out how to act, right? And in the same way, what we've seen in cyberspace is that the most effective way that threat actors have been able to achieve their malicious aims was by a decentralized model too, figuring out who to target, what to do, what targets next, what to take. And in this very model, lies what we need to do in 2020. You sitting there in a security team or at a manufacturer or at a bank, you are on the front lines. You are the edge of figuring out what the next dynamic of this threat will be. That's my prediction for 2020. You are part of figuring out where this threat will go, how we solve it. And the way that we do that is by making sure we understand it, making sure we have the tools, and then knowing that it is up to us to change security. Thank you.